When we talk about war, we typically picture battlefields, soldiers, maybe those intense strategy meetings down in bunkers, right?
Right, the very real physical conflict.
Exactly. But what actually happens when we start using that same really potent word for, well, everything else? I mean, think about it. A war on drugs, the culture wars, or even when we just jokingly declare war on a messy room.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
It's so common, it's so deep in our everyday language that honestly, it often barely registers. We just say it.
And that's precisely what's so fascinating here, isn't it?
Yeah.
The authors we're diving into today, George Chaney and Sally Planoff, in their really insightful article, The Problems with War Talk, they invite us to critically examine something so ingrained.
Something we use almost without thinking.
Exactly. Something we use almost unconsciously. It genuinely makes you ask an important question about the sort of hidden power of our metaphors, especially one as potent as loaded as war.
That's a really crucial distinction. This deep dive is entirely dedicated to that single loaded word, war, and how its metaphorical use, well, profoundly shapes our understanding.
Right.
How it tragically fuels division and, surprisingly, can even get in the way of the very solutions we're trying to achieve. Often without us even realizing the subtle ways it's influencing how we think. We're really pulling out the most powerful insights directly from their piece, which was published by the National Communication Association.
And it's also worth highlighting the context of this source because that adds another layer. This article actually started out as a nonpartisan column. It was called Another Perspective.
Oh, interesting. In a local paper.
Yeah, in a local newspaper, the Moab Times Independent. Its core purpose was basically to encourage reflection, to get people talking about familiar topics, but maybe from fresh angles, unexpected angles.
Right.
It's actually a fantastic example of what we sometimes call public translation in communication studies.
Taking academic ideas and making them accessible.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Taking complex academic ideas, breaking them down, and making them relevant for everyday conversations. Making sure that valuable research doesn't just stay locked up in scholarly journals, but actually impacts public understanding.
And that really is exactly our mission here at the Deep Dive. Our goal today is to carefully unpack why this seemingly harmless language, this casual, almost, sometimes flippant use of war, why it can be so incredibly potent. And problematic. We'll explore some surprising facts about how it impacts our perceptions, our choices, and hopefully offer you, the listener, some really valuable insights into how you engage with information, with conversations, every single day. We're going to dissect the subtle but huge power of just one word and think about its far-reaching consequences.
It's a word that carries just an enormous amount of historical and emotional weight.
Absolutely.
Yet, as you pointed out, we often use it almost carelessly, like it's a heavy hammer we started using for everything, from delicate carpentry to stirring coffee.
Right. That's a great analogy.
The disconnect between its real meaning and how we apply it metaphorically it's profound.
So let's jump right in. Let's start exploring the subtle power and often the really profoundly unintended consequences of what the authors call war talk.
Okay.
The first thing that really hits you when you dig into this topic is just how utterly pervasive this metaphor is. It's not just stuck in political speeches or media hype.
Oh, not at all.
This language of conflict, it seeps into our casual conversations, into how we talk about our own lives, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely.
We talk about fighting traffic, battling deadlines, waging war and procrastination, or even winning an argument. It's like our default setting for any challenge.
Indeed. It's almost like an automatic linguistic reflex.
Yeah.
The authors highlight how easily we default to this language, like it's our pre-programmed way of thinking about any big challenge or opposition we face. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, how human communication works, it really shows how seemingly small word choices can have these profound long-term effects on our perceptions, our relationships, even the whole fabric of society.
So it's subtle but powerful.
Extremely subtle. The insidious power of this metaphor is right there in its subtle impact. Even when it doesn't lead to actual fighting, the mere talk about war can instantly raise tensions.
Right.
It creates this adversarial dynamic, and subtly but powerfully, it demonizes others as the enemy.
Yeah.
It sets up an us versus them framework right from the start, often before we even begin to think critically about the issue itself.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Often, these metaphorical wars, they start with the best intentions, noble intentions even.
Hmm.
I mean, over the past 50 years in the U.S. alone, we've seen so many examples. The war on crime, the war on poverty, the war on drugs, even the war on cancer. On the surface, the idea behind declaring these things often feels genuinely positive, maybe even inspiring.
Precisely. The aim is usually to galvanize public action, right? To muster resources, to signal this all-out effort against some deep, tough problem.
Like declaring it a major threat.
Exactly. The intention is to say, this problem is so severe, so threatening, it requires an extreme, unified response. Hence, you declare war. It's designed to mobilize everyone, rally the public around a shared, scary adversary.
But then you look at specific cases like the war on drugs, which the article really focuses on with stark clarity, and you start to see how that metaphor, even with those good intentions, can be disastrously used to justify actions that end up being far more hurtful than helpful.
It really is a stark, poignant example. The authors point out that observers from, well, across the whole political spectrum, left, right, center, now pretty much agree that this war was fundamentally mislabeled.
Mislabeled and misguided.
And, in really important ways, deeply misguided right from the start. What happens is, once drug users, or even addiction itself, become the enemy in this war, well, society becomes far less likely to think about solutions based on support, public health, treatment.
Instead, it becomes about punishment.
Exactly. Instead, the focus shifts almost entirely to punishment, criminalization, enforcement. And this brings up a really critical question, doesn't it? How does framing a complex social challenge like addiction or poverty as a war inherently shift our approach?
From problem solving to fighting.
Yes. From collective, maybe empathetic problem solving, where you try to understand root causes and provide support to adversarial combat, where the goal is just to conquer an enemy. It implies a winner and a loser, rather than a shared societal goal that needs nuanced, collaborative, often compassionate solutions.
The metaphor itself pushes towards punishment.
It really does. The metaphor itself dictates a punitive response,
Yeah.
rather than, say, a therapeutic or preventative one.
That's the painful irony, isn't it? The initial idea was maybe to solve a huge societal problem, but it backfires because the very language we use to frame it is flawed. It fundamentally shapes our actions in these deeply unintended, often tragic ways. And the grim reality, as the article really underscores, is that our prisons are full of people who have not harmed others, yet have been victims of this war. I mean, think about the staggering numbers. Millions incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses, a crisis that has hit minority communities incredibly hard, fractured countless families. This wasn't just some policy choice made in a vacuum.
No, it was driven by the metaphor.
It was a societal shift driven by that war metaphor, turning addiction from a public health crisis into a criminal enemy that just had to be beaten.
And the ripple effect of that misapplied metaphor. It continues to impact so many lives and communities, even today. Policies like mandatory minimum sentencing, aggressive asset forfeiture laws where authorities could seize property even without a criminal conviction. Those were direct results of this war mindset.
Right, the tools of war applied domestically.
The very framing of the issue as a war led directly to policies of confrontation, of incapacitation, rather than policies focused on care, prevention, rehabilitation. It's just a vivid illustration of how language can literally reshape national policy and individual lives.
Okay, now let's broaden our view a bit. Let's look at how this pervasive war talk escalates divisions. Not just in these big social issues, but from massive global conflicts right down to the deep cultural rifts that often tear apart our own societies.
A really powerful example the authors dig into is the whole broad sweep of the war on terror that followed September 11th, 2001. Immediately after those attacks, there was this very brief, almost blink and you miss it, momentary consideration of other responses, maybe more limited police actions against specific terrorist networks.
A different framing.
Yes, a different frame. It was a brief pause, a moment of reflection when other options, maybe more targeted, more legally defined, were still manageable.
But it was, as you said, just a brief moment. Instead, the war on terror was launched abruptly in October of that same year.
Right.
And what's critical, I think, is that for years it stayed this incredibly broad, vague, largely undefined war. It wasn't until 2013, more than 10 years later, that the U.S. government officially announced more specific targets and objectives.
And the authors highlight a truly chilling detail, a telling detail that just perfectly captures the open-ended nature of this conflict.
What's that?
On many U.S. war memorials, where the words War on Terror are inscribed, there's only a starting date, September 11, 2001, and very noticeably, no end date.
Wow, still open.
Still open. And if we connect this to the broader idea of rhetorical framing, this example powerfully shows how a metaphorical war declared against an abstract noun like terror, well, it can lead to this completely open-ended commitment, both rhetorical and practically.
Which makes it impossible to win, really.
It makes it incredibly difficult, almost impossible, to define victory, to set clear metrics for success, or even figure out when you might stop or pull back. It creates a kind of perpetual state of conflict, a permanent state of emergency, almost.
That idea of a blanket war, it's really something to grapple with. When you declare war on something as fuzzy, as ever-present as terror itself, what does that even mean you're fighting?
Exactly.
How do you define victory in a fight like that? And indeed, as the authors point out very sharply, many, perhaps most Americans, would now admit that it was wrong-headed to declare a blanket war against all forms of and groups involved in terror. That's a pretty widespread admission of a major misstep, both strategic and rhetorical.
And this sort of conceptual perpetual state is profoundly dangerous because it gives this ongoing justification for a huge range of actions: surveillance, military interventions, restricting civil liberties, even when their effectiveness or appropriateness might be seriously questioned if you looked at them outside that all-encompassing war frame.
Right.
The lack of an end date on those memorials, it isn't just a logistical detail. It reflects the basic difficulty in conceptually ending a conflict against an abstract noun, which perpetually allows you to invoke wartime powers and reasons.
Okay, now let's bring this lens of war talk maybe closer to home. Let's look at the entrenchment of what we usually call the culture wars. This term is used all the time, and generally we understand it to mean highlighting these stark differences between groups on big, often moral issues. Debates over U.S. history in schools or contentious social issues like abortion or gender identity. It sounds like it's just defining a problem, right? Articulating a divide.
Yeah. Now, that's certainly the surface intention, to name a clear divide in society. But the article brilliantly shows how problematic that label, culture wars, becomes when it's then used to justify almost any action against the other side.
Okay, so it's not just description, it's justification.
Yeah, exactly. It quickly slides from describing a disagreement into basically sanctioning hostility. This framing actively stops us from seeing bridges between different opinions and groups, or even just the possibility of agreeing to disagree and moving on constructively. It just demonizes the opposition.
So what does this mean for our ability to find common ground, to navigate difficult conversations, or just move forward as a society? If every disagreement, every different view becomes a full-blown culture war, how do we ever find a path to resolution, or even just basic understanding?
Well, the article argues that the possibility for creative, collaborative solutions can just vanish in this thick fog of blame, demonization, mutual attacks.
And sadly, we see this play out every day. Public forums, legislatures, even within families.
It really raises a profound question. When our deeply held differences get framed as an existential war, don't we lose sight of the shared humanity, the fundamental common ground, the potential for cooperation that still exists, even when we profoundly disagree? The authors emphasize that culture wars fiercely energize identity politics. They draw people into these tribal camps.
Us versus them.
Totally us versus them. And they tragically distract from common concerns that can unite us, like improving our local community, ensuring economic stability for everyone, protecting the environment we all share.
Things that affect everybody.
Things that affect everybody. And maybe most critically, these culture wars are strikingly difficult to transcend emotionally. The language itself digs the trenches deeper, making it incredibly hard for people to step out of their role as fighters and engage with empathy or even just intellectual curiosity.
It's almost like we get so focused on the fight, so emotionally invested in the conflict itself, that we completely forget there's a bigger community we share, a society we're all part of, common problems that affect everyone, no matter which side they're on.
Exactly.
The war frame forces us into that binary rather than letting us think of it as all of us working on a complex problem together.
And that emotional entrenchment is particularly insidious, isn't it? It means that even when perfectly logical, evidence-based solutions are put on the table, the war frame can make it almost impossible for people to even consider them.
Because it feels like surrender.
Yeah, they're so deeply invested in the conflict and the identity they've formed through that conflict that stepping back to objectively look at alternatives can feel like betrayal, like surrender. It's a really powerful psychological barrier to making progress.
Okay, now let's dig even deeper into the really chilling consequences of this pervasive war talk. its inherently dehumanizing logic and the profound moral blind spots it seems to systematically create.
The authors specifically call out the "this means war" tactic, which, as we talked about, can happen not just on the world stage, but even in, personal relationships or tense public meetings.
Right, declaring war on your noisy neighbor.
Huh. Yeah, maybe not that extreme, but announcing "this means war" in a serious context is often explicitly a precursor to tossing rules out the window. It immediately implies that old saying, "all's fair in love and war," which is a pretty dangerous idea in any conflict,
Yeah.
but especially in civil discourse.
And critically, it suggests that anyone who opposes you, and anyone with a different opinion, anyone just standing in your way, isn't just someone with another viewpoint.
No, they're trying to destroy you.
They're actively engaged in an attempt to destroy you and your allies. It's an immediate, often irrational jump to seeing them as an existential threat.
Exactly. And from a strategic rhetorical standpoint, the authors, drawing on communication scholar F.G. Bailey, explain that saying "we are at war" is very often a highly effective tactic, a tactic used to shut down a meeting or force those who disagree out of the room.
Because dissent becomes disloyalty.
Precisely. If it's war, then dissent isn't just disagreement. It can be framed as disloyalty, as undermining the war effort, or at least as a dangerous distraction from the main goal, winning at all costs. The very essence of the war metaphor implies deliberate, organized violence as the way to solve a problem. And from that rhetoric, it becomes a chillingly small, logical step to internalize the thought, okay, I better do whatever I can to destroy the other side and what they hold dear because they're trying to destroy me.
It's terrifying how just a phrase, a linguistic declaration, can so readily give permission to abandon civility, fairness, even basic rules of engagement, simply by declaring a war. It sort of creates a license for aggression, where things you might not have thought of doing suddenly seem okay, justifiable.
And what's truly fascinating here, and deeply concerning from a communication perspective, is how this linguistic move, shifting from seeing others as merely mistaken or misguided to labeling them as fundamentally evil or mad, how it effectively slams shut any possibility for understanding, for dialogue, for reconciliation.
It's a communication shutdown.
It's a complete communication shutdown. As communication scholar Robert Ivy observed, looking across history, societies tragically jump to the last resort by labeling another group either bad or mad or both. This isn't just name-calling, it's a profound rhetorical strategy to basically rationalize hostility.
And once that label is stuck on, that dehumanizing label,
Then the language of savagery or insanity becomes a terrifyingly effective tool for dehumanization. It then serves as a powerful justification for all-out opposition, and chillingly even for destruction. It's a way of systematically stripping away their humanity, making it easier to avoid grappling with the really deep moral consequences of your actions against them.
it also distorts reality, right?
Oh, hugely. For example, personifying an entire rogue nation solely through its leader who's labeled crazy or evil can completely divert attention from the millions of lives at stake within that nation.
Reducing a whole country to one person.
Exactly. It reduces complex geopolitical realities with their huge populations and intricate societies down to a simple caricature, which makes it far easier to justify harsh, sweeping actions that impact real people. The philosopher Kenneth Burke, a foundational figure in communication theory, he pleaded with us to consider that it's better to try to think of others who think or act differently as mistaken rather than as evil.
Why? What's the benefit of that?
Because, he argued, that approach leaves open crucial lines of communication. And, vitally, it even leaves open the possibility of each side admitting they might not be completely right. It fosters a kind of intellectual humility.
That nuance, that space for maybe being wrong yourself is so absolutely critical for any kind of progress, isn't it?
It is.
And the authors are incredibly clear on this. This is not to deny the existence of evil in the world, but only to say we should be more cautious in rushing to name it. It's about using careful judgment, a kind of rhetorical responsibility, not just naively dismissing real threats. It's a call for precision instead of using inflammatory labels.
Precisely. Cultivating that nuance allows for this critical space where real dialogue can still happen, where compromise isn't automatically seen as surrender, and where the immense human cost of conflict isn't forgotten just for the sake of a convenient, simple story. It's a conscious choice to keep the channels of understanding open, even when you strongly disagree.
And this leads us to maybe the most profound moral blind spot created by war talk. the tendency to completely forget the deep moral dimension that's inherent in conflict. Philosopher and theologian James Childress provides a powerful reminder here. He says that by relying on the language of war, we often forget the moral dimension.
Indeed. When we think of war, especially metaphorically, it's often just seen as complete destruction or defeat. Simple as that.
Right, win or lose.
But this simplistic view systematically ignores a whole series of really crucial questions. Questions that often go completely unanswered when we jump to this metaphor. Questions like, how do we treat others in this context? How does one side or both sides actually get out of the war intact? What is the fundamental morality of war? When, if ever, is war truly just? What rules, what ethical boundaries still apply during wartime? When is the war actually over?
And what does winning even mean?
Yeah, exactly. What does winning truly look like beyond just destruction? What's the comprehensive plan for managing the aftermath, for rebuilding, for reconciling? This really raises a critical question about responsibility, about foresight. Language, particularly the powerful, all-consuming language of war, it could abstract us from the very real human, societal, and ethical costs involved. It lets us bypass the tough moral thinking that actual conflict demands.
It's like we get so caught up in the idea of fighting, in the thrill or the perceived absolute necessity of the battle, that we completely forget to ask the most basic questions. What happens when the fight is supposedly over? Or even, should it have started in the first place?
Yeah.
The easy, almost reflexive jump to war talk effectively begs all these profound questions. But more often than not, when we jump to that language, we just don't consider the huge implications until it's tragically far too late.
The metaphor of war gives us this incredibly convenient cognitive shortcut. It lets us bypass the complex, often agonizing ethical thinking that real conflict requires.
It simplifies everything.
It simplifies the moral landscape into this clear-cut battlefield of good versus evil, which, as history shows us again and again, is almost never the nuanced reality. It's a dangerous simplification that eases the path to actions that might otherwise be morally unacceptable.
Okay, so let's explore some of these very real-world impacts and also dig into the powerful, almost irresistible, seductive simplicity that war talk seems to offer so readily.
A prime example, very contemporary, that the article brings up powerfully is the ongoing immigration debate, which is too often cast as a kind of war.
You hear that language all the time. Invasion, under siege.
All the time. And this framing, the authors argue very strongly, does everyone a disservice.
Yeah.
It harms immigrants, it harms native-born citizens, it harms the fabric of society itself. It can be devastatingly used to justify extremely harsh actions against entire populations that have been declared different and a threat.
When we frame something as complex, as deeply human, as multifaceted as immigration, when we frame that as a war, it immediately, automatically, tragically creates an enemy where there should be shared humanity, or at the very least, a complex social issue needing nuanced, compassionate solutions. On a personal level, the authors point out, this war mentality can be used to justify targeting innocent individuals, which is a heartbreaking reality we see in schools, universities, where minority students are told to get out just because of their background.
And at the policy level, this pervasive war metaphor effectively prevents us from seeing, for example, the pressing needs of refugees who may be fleeing real war and terror in their own countries.
It shifts the focus entirely.
Entirely. It shifts the whole focus away from humanitarian concerns, away from the plight of individuals desperately seeking safety, towards seeing them only as security threats. This dramatically limits our collective empathy and severely restricts our policy options, pushing us towards exclusion, towards building walls, rather than integration or support.
The language blinds us.
The language effectively blinds us to the very real, often desperate circumstances of people who are already, often tragically, victims of actual hot conflicts somewhere else.
And a big part of why this happens, part of the seductive power of this language, is that almost irresistible pull of the good guys versus bad guys story.
Yeah.
It's just too convenient, too cognitively easy to blame another group and other for our problems, our insecurities, our fears. And when we do that over and over, that group inevitably turns into the enemy, and then we're off, feeling invaded, under siege, or indeed at war.
There's a profound, almost primal seductiveness of the collective meaning and direction that can come with mobilization for war, as the authors observe, citing journalist Chris Hedges.
It gives clarity, right? Purpose.
Exactly. It offers this intoxicating sense of clarity, a clear purpose, an identifiable enemy in what otherwise feels like a messy, complex world. But the critical fact, the one often overlooked, is that it's inherently hard to hold on to a mixed view of someone else or another society or country.
Our brains don't like ambiguity.
Not really. Our minds, searching for comfort and simplicity, find it far more comfortable to move toward a position of either complete acceptance or complete rejection.
Hmm.
Black or white, good or evil. And if we connect this to communication theory, this tendency to simplify the world into these stark binaries isn't just a casual habit, it's a powerful cognitive shortcut. It speaks to what rhetoricians call framing theory, how the initial way we present an issue, like framing it as a war, doesn't just describe it, it actually constructs our reality around it.
It sets the terms of the debate.
Precisely. It gives us that sense of comfortable clarity in a complex world. A simple story where we're the heroes and the other is the villain. But that comfort, as the authors rigorously show, comes at a severe cost. It often obscures the real messy complexities and the millions of lives caught in the middle.
Here's where it really hits you. The idea that a simple narrative might feel good. It might make us feel better, at least for a little while, give us a sense of control or righteousness.
Yeah.
But it is fundamentally deeply dangerous. The authors give a particularly poignant example related to the Iraq War. The almost complete disregard of the positive aspects of Iraqi society, the education and political representation of women, for example, in the campaign to treat Saddam Hussein and his admittedly dictatorial regime as a new global threat. The nuance just got wiped out.
Utterly obliterated by the need for a simple good versus evil story. That simplification, that rigid good guys and bad guys picture of the world, it undeniably makes it easier to organize things, to rally public support, to make difficult decisions seem straightforward and necessary.
That is misleading.
It is profoundly misleading and, as the authors state unequivocally, often quite dangerous. Precisely because it wipes out crucial information, ignores complex realities, and leads to actions based on an incomplete, often distorted understanding of the situation and the people involved. It's basically sacrificing truth for rhetorical convenience.
Okay, so if war talk is so deeply problematic, so insidious in its effects, what are the alternative? How can we consciously choose words, choose frames that foster connection, understanding, collaboration, instead of just perpetuating conflict and division? The article actually offers some really inspiring and constructive ways to reframe problems.
Yeah, this is the hopeful part. The core principle they put forward is incredibly empowering. We absolutely can talk about differences among people and describe social problems in many ways that both recognize the problem and bring people together.
So it's not about ignoring problems.
Not at all. They're not advocating for ignoring or sugarcoating difficult issues.
Yeah.
Quite the opposite. They're advocating for framing these challenges in a way that inherently encourages collaborative solutions rather than adversarial combat. And what's truly fascinating here is that the authors aren't just critiquing. They're offering concrete, actionable alternatives, alternatives that consciously redirect our collective energy towards finding solutions, not just identifying opposition.
And they give some genuinely creative, thought-provoking examples. Like, instead of defaulting to the stark war on cancer, they suggest we talk about a comprehensive plan to cure cancer. Doesn't that just sound immeasurably more hopeful, more scientific, more collaborative?
It really does. It invokes a sense of collective scientific effort rather than a fight against some mysterious, abstract enemy.
Or consider the war on poverty. How much more inspiring, more inclusive, more achievable does it sound to reframe it as a program to reduce poverty, as a kind of space program all aboard?
Right. That invokes a sense of a shared national journey, collective ambition, a challenge to be overcome through ingenuity, not a fight against the segment of our own society.
Yeah.
And with the war on drugs, they propose this deeply empathetic shift, talking about drugs, like opioids, as a demon to which we as a society are vulnerable, echoing the historical framing of demon rum.
Interesting. What does that do?
Well, this powerful metaphor acknowledges the huge challenge and harm, but crucially, it shifts responsibility. From blaming individuals to recognizing a shared societal vulnerability that requires a unified, supportive response, rather than punitive warfare against our own citizens.
And instead of the broad, unending war on terror,
They suggest framing it as moving toward a world that is free of terror, which implies a sustained social movement, right? A collective striving for peace and stability through many different means, not just an unending, ill-defined military campaign.
or discussing an alternative future for energy instead of a combative war on fossil fuels. It shifts the focus from destruction to innovation to building something new.
And maybe the most crucial alternative they highlight, the sort of overarching principle behind all the others, is simply to talk about the need for complicated solutions to complex problems.
Not very catchy, maybe.
No, they readily admit it may not be catchy, it might not fit on a bumper sticker or a news headline, but it is unequivocally realistic. It fundamentally shifts the entire mindset, away from seeking quick, decisive victories against an enemy, towards embracing sustained, nuanced, often collaborative efforts to address multifaceted challenges. It acknowledges the inherent complexity of the real world.
That brings us to the profound importance of embracing nuance and actively, intentionally resisting that impulse toward total opposition.
Yes.
The authors stress that we do best when we don't maximize or exaggerate differences in our talk about others. We have to consciously acknowledge that in most cases there are going to be disagreements and points of tension. That's normal.
Yeah.
It's just a natural part of human interaction, not necessarily an act of aggression.
Yes, recognizing that disagreement is normal, even healthy, in a vibrant society, rather than seeing it as an immediate act of aggression or an existential threat. That's a truly critical first step. Yeah. The authors implore us to resist the idea of total opposition, meaning the notion that if someone disagrees with you on one thing, they must be diametrically opposed to you on everything else, and therefore they must be the enemy.
Right, rejecting the whole person because of one disagreement.
Exactly.
Right.
And what this means in practice is that while it's often hard to hold on to a mixed view of someone else or another society because our brains really do crave those simple categories, it is absolutely essential. Essential for productive engagement, for keeping communication channels open, and for finding any kind of common ground. And this raises a profoundly important question for all of us, doesn't it? Especially now, in an era of increasing polarization. How can we, as individuals and as a society, consciously choose language that opens pathways for understanding, for dialogue, for collaboration, rather than constantly choosing words that shut them down and just dig the trenches deeper?
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? How you approach disagreements, whether it's in your personal life or in public discussions, or even just how you process the news, the headlines, online conversations? It means actively cultivating that mixed view, doesn't it? Even when it feels uncomfortable, even when it challenges your own assumptions. Because that fundamentally is where real understanding can start and where genuine progress is actually possible. It requires a conscious effort, a rhetorical choice, really.
It demands a conscious effort to challenge those easy binaries, to look beyond the simple good guys and bad guys narrative, and to choose words that acknowledge complexity, that foster empathy, and that ultimately affirm our shared humanity, even with those we disagree with.
Choosing dialogue over demonization.
Exactly. It is about consistently opting for dialogue over demonization, for understanding over accusation, and for collaboration over conflict. It's a daily, intentional practice of, well, linguistic self-awareness.
Today, we've taken a truly deep dive into the profound, often hidden impact of the war metaphor in our everyday language and public discourse. We've meticulously explored how, even when it's used with the best, most noble intentions, this powerful rhetorical device can lead to profoundly harmful policies, how it can systematically shut down vital dialogue, subtly dehumanize others, and dangerously simplify complex issues into these misleading, often destructive binaries.
The power of language, as we've really explored today, is immense. It shapes not just how we speak, but how we think and how we act. And the war metaphor is singularly potent.
Yeah.
By becoming acutely aware of the metaphors we use, especially this one, we empower ourselves. We can consciously choose to shift our conversations away from conflict towards constructive problem solving, away from opposition towards collaboration, fostering understanding instead of just digging in deeper into division.
The authors, George Cheney and Sally Planup, they conclude their insightful article by asking this truly powerful, resonant question, and it's one we want to leave you with today, something for you to maybe mull over long after this deep dive ends. They ask, do we really want to act as if war were the norm rather than the exception in our daily lives? We have enough real or hot wars going on in the world without bringing on more.
Wow. That's a compelling call to examine our own linguistic habits, isn't it? To consider the ripple effects they have and to recognize the profound responsibility that comes with the words we choose every day.
Absolutely.
We wholeheartedly encourage you, the listener, to listen closely to the language around you, especially when difficult topics come up. and to critically consider how framing a problem as a war might inherently be limiting our collective ability to find truly comprehensive, compassionate, and sustainable solutions.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.